And when I'm working with clients, there are a number of symptoms or signs that I often see that generally tell me you have elevated cortisol. So let's break it down. So, just a disclaimer, we are not talking about levels that are so high in which you push into a condition called Cushing's disease. However, we are talking about chronically elevated levels of cortisol that generally come from having a lot of stress. One of the big signs that I see is difficulty with your sleeping. And this can run the gamut from difficulty falling asleep to difficulty staying asleep to waking up just not feeling refreshed. And the reason why this is such a common pattern is because when we are chronically stressed, cortisol gets out of whack. So our cortisol should have this nice smooth, what we call diurnal pattern. It should start to rise about an hour or so before waking and then reach its peak for the day about an hour to 90 minutes after waking up. Then the cortisol should start to come down throughout your day, generally being at its lowest when it's time to go to bed. Now, this is important because when cortisol is high, that means we are blocking the production of melatonin. Melatonin being that hormone that says, hey, it's time to go to bed. It's what helps to regulate our circadian rhythm or our sleep-wake cycle. So when cortisol is high, we literally are not producing melatonin. And the vice versa is true. When melatonin is high, we're not producing a lot of cortisol. And this makes sense because when it's time to go to bed, melatonin should be elevated because we're getting that signal from our brain that says, hey, go to sleep. But when we are chronically stressed and we have those chronically elevated levels of cortisol, what generally can happen is that cortisol stays high so that even though you're tired, when it comes to time to go to bed, you can't actually go to sleep. Or another common pattern I often see is that cortisol will actually start to elevate hours before you're meant to wake up. So if you've been waking up consistently like 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, like well before your wake up time, it could be the cortisol. So it can often cause what we call a shift in our cortisol curve or a cortisol awakening response. If you want more details on how all that works, you can check out this video up here. Another symptom we often start to see is the brain fog, the poor concentration, the poor memory. Now again, this actually makes sense because when cortisol again is chronically elevated, and again, I'm not talking about the acute type of stress response that we all have, right? We should be able to respond to stressors during our day. I'm talking about the chronic stress, the stuff that's been going on for months and years. So when we have these chronically elevated levels of cortisol, they can actually start to affect our brain, and especially those areas that have to do with our learning or our working memory and our concentration or our focus. So this is where brain fog starts to pop up as well. I do have a video all about the mechanism about what is happening, but in short, the higher levels of cortisol actually start to decrease the neurons or the connections in the area of our brain called the hippocampus that is responsible for our working memory and being able to actually learn new things, and also starts to increase the area in the amygdala, which is often called our fear center, but it's also responsible for our fear and even producing things like anxiety, which leads me to my next point is that another symptom of chronically elevated cortisol might be changes in your mood. Now, these can also kind of range the gamut. You could start to have more things like anxiety. That chronic elevation in cortisol, if it's coming from chronically being stressed, will often come along with elevated levels of adrenaline, which can often make you feel anxious if there's nothing actually to be responding to. If there's no reason for our heart rate to go up because we're not running away from something, or we're not dealing with an immediate stressor, then we start to feel nervous and anxious all the time. On the other side of things, another thing I commonly see is irritability. Like you start to have just a very short bandwidth for dealing with situations. The most common thing I see with my clients is that they're able to get through work, sometimes just barely or by a thread, but when they get home, they snap so easily at things that they would never really respond to. So that change in irritability or frustration or sometimes even anger is often really common with high levels of cortisol. It's not just you. You're not losing it. It's literally your physiology. Another symptom that I see really chronically and that a lot of people really struggle with is weight gain, and specifically belly fat. Again, I have a whole video talking about the mechanism here, but in short, that chronically elevated level of cortisol basically starts a pathway in which your body ends up storing more visceral fat. It is affecting your glucose regulation and often your lipid metabolism. And the end result is that we start to put on weight around the middle. And the reason why this weight is so dangerous is because it's usually visceral fat, which is around your organs and generally located in the center as well. This is the type of fat that puts us at higher risks for things like type 2 diabetes, as well as cardiovascular risk and a host of other conditions. So if you've been growing around the middle, even though you haven't really changed your eating habits or your exercise habits, cortisol could be the culprit. Another thing I commonly see is inflammation, and this can present itself in a number of ways. You can start to get a lot of joint or muscle pain. Sometimes if you have an autoimmune condition, it could cause that to flare. And it can also cause things like dryness of the skin. Cortisol, when chronically elevated for for a longer period of time, again, it can be inflammatory. So it can start to kick up a bunch of issues that are related to inflammation. And we know from research that being chronically inflamed can lead to a whole host of other disease processes as well. Now, again, this is not an exhaustive list of all the symptoms of having chronically elevated cortisol, but these are the ones that I pretty much see most commonly. So for some people, just knowing these symptoms are not enough. There are ways to test for cortisol. Again, I have a video all about how I do that. And this is actually something that I do with every client that comes inside of my coaching program, the Better Health Blueprint. We break down the different ways in which stress might be pushing on cortisol, and we look and see which systems have been affected, and we actually test rather than guess your cortisol levels as well. So if that's something you're interested in, if these symptoms are resonating with you and you're ready to do something about it, you can click on the link in the description box and you can learn how to work with me inside of my coaching program. Now, next question you may be having is what to do about these chronically elevated levels of cortisol. In short, I'll say we need to really work on lifestyle changes. So working with your sleep, working with your mindset, working with your diet, and working with your movement. But if you want to learn more about that, then why don't you check out this video here? All right, I hope that this video was helpful and that you've learned something. And otherwise, I will see you in the next video. Bye.